It was a sunny afternoon when Max, an elderly golden retriever, lay peacefully in his backyard. His fur was grey with age, and his movements slow, but his eyes still sparkled with warmth. However, his quiet afternoon was suddenly interrupted by two police officers who entered the yard, looking for a suspect. Seeing Max, they mistook him for a threat due to his large size and began to act aggressively. Max stood up slowly, confused by the officers' loud voices. His old body trembled as they shouted commands at him. The officers, nervous and uncertain, raised their batons, preparing to defend themselves from what they saw as a threat. Max whimpered, sensing the tension but not understanding it. He took a few steps back, his tail tucked between his legs. The officers advanced, trying to corner him. Just then, the back door swung open, and Max's owner, Sarah, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, rushed out. "Max!" she cried. The officers turned, startled by her sudden appearance. "Stop!" Sarah yelled. "He's just an old dog." The officers hesitated, lowering their batons. Sarah hurried over to Max, kneeling beside him and hugging him tightly. "He's harmless," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's been with me for 15 years. The officers, now realizing their mistake, exchanged guilty glances. They apologized, explaining that they were searching for a suspect who had fled into the neighborhood. Sarah, still holding Max, nodded but remained firm. "Please be more careful next time." As the officers left, Max nuzzled Sarah's hand, grateful for her protection. She smiled down at him. "You're safe now, boy," she whispered, stroking his fur gently. "No one will hurt you as long as I'm here." Max lay down again, comforted by his owner's presence, and the peaceful afternoon resumed, but now with a deeper bond between them. A few days after the incident, Sarah noticed something unusual about Maximum. He seemed restless, pacing around the yard and sniffing at the fence, as if searching for something. His old body struggled, but his eyes were determined. Curious, Sarah followed him around the yard, wondering what had gotten into her normally calm companion. That night, Max whined at the back door, something he hadn't done in years. Sarah, concerned, opened the door to let him out, watching as he trotted to the far end of the yard. His nose pressed against the fence, and he barked softly. She grabbed a flashlight and approached, crouching down beside him. Max's behavior grew more urgent. He pawed at the dirt near the fence, and Sarah, sensing something was off, knelt down to inspect the area. To her shock, she found a small hole dug at the base of the fence, large enough for a person to squeeze through. It wasn't Max who had done it. This was recent. Suddenly, it all made sense. The officers had been looking for someone, and that someone had been in her yard. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood up. She realized that the officers' intrusion hadn't been random after all. The suspect they were chasing had used her backyard to escape. And now, it seemed, Max had picked up on something she hadn't. Max let out another low growl, his body tense. Sarah shined her flashlight over the fence into the alley behind her house. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Quickly, she grabbed Max's collar and retreated back into the house, locking the door behind her. She called the police, reporting the suspicious activity. As she waited, her mind raced. Whoever had been in her yard was still out there, and they might come back. Max, despite his old age, remained vigilant by the door, his eyes focused and ears perked. He seemed to sense the danger and was ready to protect his home and his owner, no matter what. When the police arrived, they searched the area thoroughly but found nothing. Still, they promised to keep a closer watch on the neighborhood, warning Sarah to be cautious. As the days went by, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Max continued to act strangely, as if he knew something she didn't. It wasn't just the officers or the suspect, they had gotten too close to something bigger. One evening, Sarah sat with Max by her side, her hand resting gently on his fur. "You're my protector, aren't you?" she whispered. Max's tail thumped softly against the floor, but his eyes never left the yard. Something was coming. And Sarah had a feeling that Max, old as he was, would be the first to know when it arrived. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The police patrols became less frequent, and Sarah tried to convince herself that the strange figure Max had spotted was long gone. But Max remained on edge, his behavior growing more unusual with each passing day. He would sit by the window, his gaze fixed on the fence, and bark at shadows that Sarah couldn't see. One night, Sarah woke up to the sound of Max growling, low and deep, a sound she hadn't heard from him in years. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding. Max was already at the back door, his body tense, eyes glued to the yard. Something was out there. Sarah grabbed her phone and crept toward the door, peeking out through the curtains. The yard was dark, bathed only in the faint glow of a street lamp, but there was movement. This time, she saw it too. A figure stood near the fence, crouched low, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. Whoever it was had come back. Max growled again, louder this time. Without thinking, Sarah unlocked the door, but before she could stop him, Max charged outside, barking fiercely. The figure froze for a split second, then bolted toward the alley behind the fence. "Max, no!" Sarah yelled, but it was too late. Max, with surprising speed for his age, ran after the intruder, disappearing into the darkness. Panicking, Sarah ran after him, her phone in hand, dialing 911 as she rushed out the door. "There's someone in my yard," she gasped into the phone, her voice shaking. "My dog, he's chasing them." As she rounded the corner, Sarah saw Max at the edge of the alley, barking wildly. The figure had vanished, but Max was determined, pawing at the ground as if trying to dig through the fence. His old body shook with the effort, but his spirit was unbreakable. The police arrived within minutes, and Sarah held Max back as the officers searched the area once again. This time, they found something, a torn piece of cloth caught on the fence, as if the intruder had been caught in their hurry to escape. The officers exchanged worried glances. "We've been looking for someone in this area for weeks," one of them said. "It's possible this person has been hiding nearby, using backyards to move around unnoticed." Sarah's heart sank. The suspect hadn't just passed through that night weeks ago. They had been watching her house all along. As the officers took the evidence and assured her they would increase patrols, Sarah looked down at Maximum. His breathing was heavy, and his old legs trembled from the exertion, but he stood tall, his eyes still scanning the yard, ever vigilant. "You're still a hero, aren't you, old boy?" Sarah whispered, kneeling beside him and scratching behind his ears. Max nuzzled her hand, his tail wagging weakly. He had protected her once again. But as Sarah walked back inside with Max by her side, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Whoever had been lurking in the shadows was still out there, and they weren't going to give up easily. Max had sensed it from the start, and now, Sarah knew they had to be ready for whatever came next. Days turned into nights, and though the police had increased their patrols, Sarah felt a persistent unease. Max's behavior hadn't changed. He stayed close to the back door, watching the yard with an intensity that Sarah had never seen before. It was as if he knew the danger hadn't passed, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. One evening, just after sunset, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Max suddenly sprang to his feet, barking louder than she'd ever heard him. His whole body was alert, facing the yard. Sarah dropped the knife she was holding and ran to the back window. Her heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the far end of the yard, was the same shadowy figure from before. This time, however, the person wasn't trying to hide. They stood tall, staring directly at the house. Max growled fiercely, pushing against the door as if trying to break through. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone to call the police again, but before she could dial, the figure stepped forward. And then, they spoke. "I'm not here to hurt you." The voice was low, gravelly, but there was no mistaking the threat that lay underneath the words. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. Max's barking intensified, and he pressed harder against the door, desperate to protect his home. Sarah took a deep breath and opened the window just a crack. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure stepped closer, still shrouded in shadows. "I'm just looking for something that belongs to me." Max growled louder, his body tense and ready to charge at any moment. Sarah could feel her pulse racing, her mind trying to make sense of what was happening. "There's nothing here for you," she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Leave now, or I'll call the police." The figure stopped, just a few feet away from the back door. "You already did, didn't you? But they can't protect you from what's coming." Before Sarah could respond, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, melting into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Max lunged at the door, barking and scratching, but Sarah pulled him back, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed to lock all the doors and windows, her hands trembling as she did. The figure's words echoed in her mind, "Something that belongs to me," but she had no idea what they meant. Who was this person, and why were they targeting her? That night, sleep didn't come easily. Max lay at the foot of the bed, his eyes constantly scanning the room, his ears perked for any sign of danger. Sarah tossed and turned, haunted by the mysterious figure's warning. The next morning, Sarah noticed something strange. Max had been digging near the fence again, but this time, there was something buried in the dirt. Curious, she grabbed a small shovel and began to unearth what Max had found. Her breath caught in her throat when she uncovered a small, metal box. It was old, rusted at the edges, and locked tight. Sarah stared at it, her mind racing. Could this be what the figure had been looking for? Carefully, she took the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. Max sat beside her, watching intently. She tried to pry it open, but the lock wouldn't budge. Whatever was inside, it had been sealed away for a long time. Determined to find answers, Sarah decided to take the box to a locksmith the next day. But as she stared at the mysterious object, a sense of dread settled over her. Whatever was inside that box, it was tied to the stranger's return. And now that she had found it, she knew things were about to get even more dangerous. Max, her loyal protector, stayed by her side, his eyes never leaving the box. It seemed the key to everything was inside, and Sarah had no idea what she would unleash when she finally opened it. The night passed slowly, filled with anxious thoughts and the occasional growl from Max, who seemed unable to rest. Sarah stayed awake for most of it, sitting at the kitchen table with the metal box in front of her. She kept running her fingers over its cold, rusted surface, her mind racing with questions. What was inside? Who had buried it in her yard? And most importantly, why did that mysterious figure believe it belonged to them? By the time dawn broke, Sarah hadn't made any progress in calming her fears. The figure's ominous words from the previous night, "they can't protect you from what's coming," kept replaying in her head. She glanced down at Max, who lay by her feet, his eyes watching the box as if he too could sense the importance of its contents. Determined to get answers, Sarah grabbed her coat and the box, heading to the locksmith in town. Max followed closely behind, his protective instincts in full force. They arrived at the locksmith shop, a small, dusty place with rows of keys hanging from the walls. The locksmith, an older man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, raised an eyebrow when Sarah placed the box on the counter. "Interesting piece," he said, running his fingers over the lock. "Looks like it hasn't been opened in decades." "I found it buried in my yard," Sarah explained, her voice laced with anxiety. "Can you open it?" The locksmith nodded. "It'll take some time, but I can give it a go." He set to work, using a variety of tools to carefully pry at the lock. As Sarah waited, her mind wandered back to the figure's words. What could possibly be inside this box that was so important? After what felt like hours, there was a soft click. The lock sprang open. The locksmith gave Sarah a small nod and pushed the box back toward her. "There you go," he said. "Be careful with whatever's inside. Old things like this tend to carry their own stories." With trembling hands, Sarah slowly lifted the lid. Inside, she found a small collection of items, each carefully placed. There were faded photographs, a set of old letters tied together with a fraying ribbon, and, at the very bottom, a strange, ornate key made of iron. The key was heavy, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed far too detailed to be just a simple house key. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the items. The photographs showed people she didn't recognize, men and women standing in front of an old house that looked nothing like hers. The letters were worn and yellowed with age, written in a handwriting she couldn't decipher. But it was the key that held her attention the longest. "What's this for?" she muttered to herself, running her fingers over the cool metal. Max sniffed the key curiously, his ears perked as if he sensed something unusual about it. The locksmith leaned in, eyeing the key with interest. "That's no ordinary key," he said quietly. "I've seen ones like it before, antiques, from old estates. It's likely tied to something valuable." Sarah's pulse quickened. Could this key be connected to the figure that had appeared in her yard? And if so, what were they after? "Thank you," Sarah said, slipping the key into her pocket and gathering the rest of the items. As she and Max left the shop, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She had uncovered something important, something dangerous. But now, she was even more uncertain about what to do next. That night, Sarah spread the items across her kitchen table, staring at each one in turn. The photographs, the letters, and especially the key, they all seemed to be pieces of a puzzle that she couldn't quite put together. As she sat there, lost in thought, there was a sudden loud knock at the front door. Sarah froze, her heart racing. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting. Max stood up instantly, growling low in his throat as he positioned himself between Sarah and the door. The knock came again, louder this time. "Sarah, open the door." Her blood ran cold. It was the same voice, the voice of the figure from the yard. How did they know her name? Panic surged through her. She grabbed the key from the table and backed away, her mind racing with options. She couldn't let them in. Whoever this person was, they wanted something dangerous. "Sarah, I know you found it," the voice called again, this time more urgent. "The key. It belongs to me. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into." Max barked, his body tense, his eyes locked on the door. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to think. She couldn't trust this person, not after everything that had happened. But she needed answers. Taking a deep breath, she moved closer to the door but didn't open it. "What do you want?" she shouted through the wood, her voice shaking. "What is this key for?" There was a long pause, and then the voice replied, softer this time. "It opens something that was locked away a long time ago. But it's dangerous, Sarah. You shouldn't have it." "Why?" she demanded, her grip tightening on the key. "Because," the voice answered, "the thing it unlocks was never meant to be found. If you open that door, you'll be putting yourself and everyone around you in danger." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at the key in her hand, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. Was this person telling the truth? Or were they trying to manipulate her into giving up the one thing they wanted? "I'm not giving it to you," she said firmly, backing away from the door. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Then, without warning, there was a loud crash, the sound of something heavy hitting the door. Max barked furiously, and Sarah gasped, clutching the key tighter. They were trying to break in. She needed to act quickly. With shaking hands, she grabbed the box, the letters, and the photographs, and stuffed them into a bag. Then, without a second thought, she ran for the back door, Max at her heels. As she fled into the night, Sarah knew one thing for sure: this was far from over. Whatever that key unlocked, it was the reason her life had been turned upside down. And now, she had to figure out the truth before it was too late. Sarah sprinted through her backyard, the cold night air biting at her skin as she clutched the bag with the key and other items. Max was right by her side, growling with every step, his eyes scanning their surroundings. Behind them, the crashing sound at the front door grew louder. Whoever the intruder was, they were determined to get inside. Her heart pounded in her ears as she reached the edge of her yard, her mind racing. She couldn't go back to the house. The figure knew where she lived, and if they were after the key, nowhere inside would be safe. She needed to hide, somewhere, anywhere, until she could figure out what to do. Max pulled ahead of her, his senses sharp, leading her toward the small woods at the back of the neighborhood. It wasn't far, but it was dark and secluded. She had no other option. Once inside the cover of the trees, Sarah slowed her pace, breathing heavily, her mind still spinning. She found a thick tree, its wide trunk offering some shelter, and crouched down, pulling Max close. She could hear her own ragged breathing, trying to calm herself. Max let out a soft growl, his nose pointed toward the direction they had come. Sarah's hand shook as she ran her fingers over his fur, trying to reassure both of them. She couldn't stay here long. She needed a plan. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out quickly and saw a text message, unknown number. "You can't run forever, Sarah. The key isn't yours to keep." Her blood ran cold. They had her number. They were watching her, following her. But how? Sarah felt a wave of panic rise up again, but she forced herself to think clearly. There had to be a reason they wanted the key so badly, something they weren't telling her. And if they were willing to go this far, it had to be more dangerous than she originally thought. As she sat there, she remembered the letters from the box. They were old and written in a strange, flowing script she couldn't make out before. But now, they seemed more important than ever. She fumbled with the bag and pulled them out, her hands shaking as she unfolded the first one. The writing was faded, but under the moonlight, she could make out enough to piece together some of the words. "To those who find this, be warned, the key must never be used. It unlocks a door that leads to." The rest of the sentence was too damaged to read. But the warning was clear. The key wasn't just some old artifact, it was tied to something much darker. A door. But what kind of door? Before she could read any further, a branch snapped nearby. Sarah froze, her heart racing as she scanned the dark forest around her. Max's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. Someone was out there. They had followed her into the woods. Sarah quickly stuffed the letters back into the bag, her hands trembling. She couldn't stay hidden much longer. Whoever was after her was closing in. She needed help, someone she could trust. But the only person who came to mind was hundreds of miles away. Her old friend Daniel, a historian, had spent years studying ancient artifacts and legends. If anyone could help her make sense of this, it was him. But she hadn't spoken to him in years. Would he even believe her? There was no time to second guess. She pulled out her phone again and sent Daniel a quick message. "I need your help. It's urgent. Call me as soon as you get this." A sudden rustling sound interrupted her. Max barked loudly, and Sarah's eyes darted to the shadows. She saw movement. Someone was getting closer. Her heart pounded as she made a snap decision. Clutching the bag, she bolted from her hiding spot, running deeper into the woods. She couldn't afford to wait for help here. She had to keep moving. Max stayed close, his growls echoing in the dark as they ran through the thick trees, the moonlight barely breaking through the canopy above. Sarah's lungs burned as she ran, her legs growing tired, but she couldn't stop. Every sound made her jump, every rustling leaf felt like a threat. She had no idea how far she had run, but eventually she reached a small clearing. There, at the edge of the clearing, was an old, abandoned cabin. It was run down, the wood weathered and cracked, but it looked sturdy enough to offer shelter. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing the creaky door open and stepping inside. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, but it was better than being out in the open. Max followed her in, sniffing around the corners of the cabin, still on high alert. Sarah slid down the wall, trying to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed again. It was Daniel. She quickly answered, whispering into the phone, "Daniel, thank God. I need your help. I found something, an old key, a metal box, letters. Someone's after me, and I think it's connected to something dangerous." There was a pause on the other end before Daniel spoke, his voice steady but concerned. "Sarah, slow down. A key. What kind of key?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "It's old, ornate. It was buried in my yard. The letters that came with it, they talk about a door that should never be opened. Someone's been following me, trying to get it. I'm scared, Daniel. I don't know what to do." Daniel was silent for a moment. Then, in a grave tone, he said, "If it's the key I think it is, you're in more danger than you realize. That key, it unlocks something very old, something that was sealed away for a reason." Sarah's breath hitched. "What does it unlock?" "A door," Daniel said quietly. "A door that leads to a place beyond this world, a place that no one should ever enter. The key has been lost for centuries. If someone is after it now, they're trying to open that door." Fear gripped Sarah. What happens if they open it? Daniel's voice grew even quieter. "Chaos. It said that the door holds something ancient, something powerful and destructive. If it's unleashed, it could destroy everything." Sarah's mind spun. She clutched the key tighter, realizing the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about her safety anymore. The fate of the world could rest in her hands. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to get rid of the key," Daniel said firmly. "Don't let it fall into the wrong hands. Find a place where no one will ever find it again. But whatever you do, don't use it." Sarah nodded, determination settling in her chest. She had to act fast. The mysterious figure wouldn't stop until they had the key. And if they succeeded, the world might never be the same. Max let out another growl, his body tense. They weren't alone. Officers harassed an elderly dog in his backyard. But when his owner arrived, everything changed. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, there lived an old dog named Rusty. Rusty had been the loyal companion of an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Henderson for as long as anyone could remember. With his graying fur, slightly clouded eyes, and a limp in his step from years of chasing after squirrels, Rusty was a familiar sight to everyone in the neighborhood. He had long since retired from the days of running through fields, but he still enjoyed spending his time in the backyard, basking in the sun and sniffing at the flowers that grew along the fence. Mrs. Henderson had raised Rusty from a pup. They had been through a lot together, countless walks, lazy afternoons, and nights spent by the fire. But now, Mrs. Henderson was growing old herself, and with her declining health, she struggled to keep up with Rusty's needs. Still, the two of them remained inseparable, and their bond was something special, something no one could quite understand. It was a warm autumn afternoon when the trouble began. Mrs. Henderson had just let Rusty out into the backyard to enjoy the fresh air when she heard a commotion from inside her house. There were voices, loud, angry voices, coming from the street. Mrs. Henderson frowned, gripping her cane tightly as she shuffled to the front window. When she looked outside, her heart sank. 2 police officers were standing at the gate to her backyard, and they were arguing with her next-door neighbor, Mr. Green. Mr. Green, a middle-aged man with a temper as fiery as his red hair, had always disliked Rusty. He claimed the old dog barked too much, even though Rusty hardly ever made a sound anymore. Mr. Green had called the police on Rusty before, but it had never amounted to anything, until now. Mrs. Henderson's stomach churned as she watched the officers, both of them towering over the elderly dog, who stood near the back door, his tail wagging uncertainly. Rusty wasn't aggressive. He was too old to pose any kind of threat, but the officers didn't seem to care. One of them, a tall man with a grim expression, was waving his hands at Rusty, trying to shoo him away. The other officer, a woman with a stern look, had a hand resting on her belt, close to her taser. "Rusty!" Mrs. Henderson called, her voice weak but filled with urgency. "Rusty, come here." But Rusty didn't move. His cloudy eyes flicked between the officers and the gate, confused by the sudden intrusion. His tail wagged slower now, his head tilting to the side as if trying to understand what was happening. One of the officers, the tall man, took a step toward Rusty. He called out, not turning to face Mrs. Henderson. "We've had complaints about your dog. He's been causing a disturbance, and we need to take care of it." Mrs. Henderson felt a surge of panic. "Rusty hasn't done anything wrong," she cried, hobbling toward the door as fast as her frail legs would carry her. "He's just an old dog, minding his own business." The officers didn't seem to hear her. The tall man crouched down, reaching toward Rusty as if to grab him by the collar. Rusty took a step back, his body tense. Mrs. Henderson's heart pounded in her chest. Rusty was too old to defend himself. He had never been aggressive in his life, but she knew that if the officers scared him, he might snap out of fear. "Please!" Mrs. Henderson shouted, finally making it to the back door. She pushed it open, her cane clattering to the ground as she hurried outside. "Please, don't hurt him." The female officer turned to her, her face softening slightly. We're just trying to handle the situation. Your neighbor has made several complaints about your dog." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "He's old," she said, her voice breaking. "He doesn't bother anyone. He just wants to be left alone. Please, just let him stay here." The male officer stood up, his face hard. "We've got a job to do. We've had reports that the dog's been causing problems. We have to take action." Rusty, sensing his owner's distress, whined softly and took a few shaky steps toward her. Mrs. Henderson bent down as much as her aching back would allow and patted his head, her fingers trembling as they ran through his thinning fur. "It's okay, Rusty," she whispered. "You're a good boy." The officers exchanged glances. The female officer seemed hesitant, but the man shook his head. "We need to take him in. We don't have a choice." At that moment, something inside Mrs. Henderson shifted. She had always been a quiet woman, never one to cause trouble. But seeing these officers threaten her beloved Rusty, seeing the fear in his old eyes, sparked something in her that she hadn't felt in years. "No," she said firmly, straightening up despite the pain in her back. "You're not taking him." The officers blinked, clearly not expecting the sudden defiance from the frail old woman. The male officer took a step forward, his hand inching toward the leash on his belt. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Mrs. Henderson stood her ground. "I said no. Rusty hasn't done anything wrong. He's never harmed anyone. He's been my companion for 15 years, and I'll be damned if I let you take him away." The female officer hesitated, glancing at her partner. "Maybe we should just leave it for now," she said quietly. "The dog's old." But the male officer was determined. "We can't just let this go," he muttered, his jaw tightening. He took another step forward, reaching for Rusty again. That's when Mrs. Henderson did something she hadn't done in years. She stepped between Rusty and the officer, her small, frail body acting as a shield for her dog. "I won't let you take him," she said, her voice steady and strong. The officer froze, his hand still in mid-reach. He stared at Mrs. Henderson for a long moment, his expression unreadable. For a brief second, it looked as if he might push past her, but then he sighed, lowering his hand. "Fine," he grumbled. "But if we get another complaint, we'll have no choice but to come back." Mrs. Henderson didn't move. She kept her eyes on the officers, refusing to back down. The female officer gave her a small nod, almost apologetic, before the two of them turned and walked back toward the street. Mr. Green, who had been watching from his yard with a smug expression, scowled as the officers left without taking Rusty. Mrs. Henderson let out a shaky breath, her legs trembling beneath her. She bent down and wrapped her arms around Rusty's neck, burying her face in his fur. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "They're gone." Rusty licked her hand, his tail wagging once more as he leaned against her. For a moment, the two of them sat there in the backyard, the autumn breeze rustling the leaves above them. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Mrs. Henderson slowly stood up, wincing at the pain in her joints. She looked down at Rusty, her heart swelling with love for the dog who had been her constant companion for so many years. "Come on, Rusty," she said softly. "Let's go inside." Together, they walked back toward the house, the bond between them stronger than ever. Rusty's steps were slow, and Mrs. Henderson's were unsteady, but they moved in perfect harmony, as they always had. And in that moment, as the door closed behind them, everything felt right in the world again. The end.